Dear President of the Göttingen Academy, dear guests, colleagues and students, a very warm welcome to everyone to this evening's lecture. It is my pleasure and a particular honor to welcome in our midst tonight's speaker, Professor Mark Smith. Professor Smith holds the chair for Old Testament literature and exegesis at Princeton Theological Seminary. Before that, he was for many years the chair of Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at New York University. He is not only an internationally leading figure in the field of biblical studies, but he is also an outstanding specialist on the literature and religion of the late Bronze Age Levantine kingdom of Ugarit. Mark Smith began his studies on Northwest Semitic literature with a thesis on the Ugaritic craftsman god Kotha Ouachasis, supervised by Marvin Pope, followed by a linguistic investigation into the origins and development of the Waf consecutive from Ugarit to Qumran, published in 1991. Only 3 years later, in 1994, Mark published a most detailed and comprehensive edition and commentary on the first 2 tablets of the Ugaritic Baal cycle, the most prominent and monumental piece of Ugaritic poetry. This commentary set new standards for future research. A second volume of the commentary on tablets 3 and 4, co-authored with Wayne Pittard, appeared in 2009. And the third and final volume on tablets 5 and 6, I want to say, volume 3 is eagerly awaited by the scholarly community. Apart from this, I want to say already opus magnum, Mark Smith contributed multiple larger and smaller studies on the poetic literature of Ugarit, all of which turned out to be highly influential for the study of these ancient texts. As we here in Göttingen started last year to publish a new comprehensive online edition of Ugaritic poetry, we are very grateful that Mark has joined the advisory board of our project, where we greatly benefit from his deep insights into the language, poetry, and imagery of the literary tradition of ancient Ugarit. At the same time, Mark is a biblical scholar, specialized in the religious history of ancient Israel in its Northwest Semitic context. Since early on, he published a series of fascinating comparative monographs on crucial biblical motifs, among which are the early history of God, Yahweh and the other deities in ancient Israel, second edition 2002, the origins of biblical monotheism, Israel's polytheistic background and the Ugaritic texts of 2001, God in translation, deities in cross-cultural discourse in the biblical world of 2008, poetic heroes, the literary commemoration of warriors and warrior culture in the early biblical world of 2014, and Where the Gods Are, spatial dimensions of anthropomorphism in the Bible world of 2016. By introducing new perspectives and concepts, such as the translatability of ancient deities, these concise and highly readable books are, in my perspective, real eye-openers that impressively demonstrate how deep the Bible is rooted in ancient Near Eastern tradition. Together with his wife, the archaeologist Elizabeth Bloch-Smith, Mark is currently working on a monumental commentary on the Book of Judges, the first volume of which has been published in 2021 in the Hermeneia series. How the Bible relates to its ancient Near Eastern background is also the topic of Mark's talk tonight. Ancient Syria and the Bible, recent developments in Ugaritic studies and their implications for biblical literature. Let me at this point announce that in this format of public lectures, it is not the local tradition here to have questions and discussions afterward in the public. So I would simply invite you to join in the applause to Mark's paper. Dear Mark, we are very glad to have you with us. This is an honor and a pleasure. The floor is yours.
Before beginning, I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me here. Before I begin, I would like to draw your attention to the handout. Everyone should have a handout, please. It includes the names of many scholars here who have made their many contributions to Ugaritic and biblical studies. Let me start with some context. Since the 19th century, the archaeological discovery of several major sites in modern-day Syria dramatically altered the scholarly landscape for biblical studies. Thanks to especially to the Amarna letters discovered in 1887, what you have is a map of where the tablets of the Amarna letters come from. They were discovered obviously in Egypt, in Amarna, but these are the places that the letters came from. They're written to the Egyptian court. But you can sort of see up and down the coast and even further inland a bit. Thanks to these letters, scholars have learned of many important cities in modern-day Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. The Amarna letters provide a sort of political map of Egypt's international relations during the 14th century, not only with the great powers around the ancient Near East, but also with the many cities of Egyptian political interest in the Levant, including the city of Ugarit. We have 5 letters from Ugarit in the Amarna letter correspondence. With this discovery of Ugarit itself beginning in 1928, well, Ugarit 29, to be a little more accurate, Ugarit has since joined the great discoveries made at several sites in Syria, including Mari, Alalat, Carchemish, Katna, and more recently Ebla, and even more recently Amar. And at the same time, there's been the long-known important coastal sites of Byblos, Beirut, Tyre, and Sidon, as well as Enkomi, located on Cyprus's northeast coast. You'll see many of those sites on this map. For late Bronze Age Ugarit, the Syrian inland sites on the one hand and the Levantine coastal sites on the other hand formed 2 overlapping circulation systems of politics and diplomacy, trade and intercultural exchange that intersected geographically further to the north at Hatti, south to Egypt, further west to the Aegean, and even further east into Mesopotamia. Standing at the crossroads, literally, of these 2 geographical orbits, ancient Ugarit intersected with both inland Syria and coastal Levant and beyond. As a reflection of these orbits, the remains at Ugarit, dating from the 14th to the early 12th century, yielded texts in 7 different languages. I won't list them all for you now. They include, of course, the homegrown language of Ugaritic itself, which reflects both the influence of Akkadian cuneiform in terms of the shape of the letters, but also the regional Levantine influence of the alphabetic tradition. Within the Levantine orbit, the letters in Ugaritic from Tyre, Sidon, and Enkomi, Amuru, and Hatti they may suggest that Ugaritic could sometimes function occasionally as a local or regional international language within the larger sphere of the influence of Akkadian. The Kingdom of Ugarit was not only on the receiving end of cross-cultural engagement, it also had an impact moving out into several directions. These are on your handout at the bottom of page 1. New Kingdom Egypt imported West Semitic deities, Baal, Anat, Astarte, Reshef, Choran, and there's other information about this influence in Egypt. Biblical scholars may recognize the name of Baal Saphon in the Egyptian setting of Exodus 14:2 and Numbers 33:7. To the north, we have the West Semitic tradition of Astarte in the sea, and Baal Saphon was celebrated in Hittite ritual literature. Westward in Greece, we have what has been thought to be in the Ugaritic text found at the site, the Greek site of Tiryns. To the east, the tradition of the West Semitic storm god appears at Mari, and perhaps even Assyriologists still sometimes concede that it even could be behind Enuma Elish. Signs of intercultural transmission are also evident in geographical names, which point to different materials, not singular, different materials moving in a number of different directions with overlapping circulation up and down the Levant. In what follows, I'm not including the short Ugaritic alphabetic inscriptions found outside of Ugarit, which are considered very nicely by one of our colleagues. I don't really know how to say her name, I apologize. Joanna Turanuri. I don't know how you say her name, I apologize. Thank you. Wonderful article, appeared in Studia Antiqua et Archaeologia in 2024, cuneiform alphabetic texts outside of Ugarit, evidence for an overland trade networks in late Bronze Age Levant. It's very interesting. It is possible to reconstruct at least 3 different routes of transmission involving Ugaritic and biblical literary traditions based on geographical names, and these are mostly at the bottom of page 2 on your handout. Some traditions may have come from Ugarit into biblical sources via Phoenician. This is all quite hypothetical. For example, one of the most common ways Baal is named at Ugarit is Baal Saphon, referring to the name of his mountain just to the north of Ugarit. The title Baal Saphon, though, is also known in Phoenician inscriptions, suggesting that Phoenician could have been the mediating point for the name in the Hebrew Bible. For example, in a passage like Psalm 48, verse 3. A different transmission route from Phoenicia via Egypt is represented by Baal Saphon in the Egyptian sources that I've already just mentioned. Other traditional material from Phoenicia may have moved independently and separately from Phoenicia north to Ugarit and south into the Bible. For example, readers are familiar with the Lebanon and Syrian mountain ranges located south of Ugarit. They appear in Psalm 29, verses 5 and 6 in the Hebrew Bible. They're, of course, very important in, I'll mention this a little bit later, Lebanon is also very important in the Ugaritic texts. Also, specifically, Baal wishes to have his choice cedar. This is a motif you see in Akkadian texts as well. He wants his cedar, and they go to the Lebanon to get it. So we see their very high awareness of the tradition of cedars of Lebanon, which also play out in 1 Kings 5 with Hiram of Tyre. Another specific data point for Phoenicia as the home of the storm god in Psalm 29 specifically is the reference to Baal Lebanon, in 8th, 7th century Phoenician inscription from Cyprus, which shows its Phoenician mainland tradition. This is page 2, number 2 on your handout, this inscription in referring to the Sidonians. We may also note that the Rephaim are associated with Phoenician Lebanon in text 22. Third, other traditions, another different sort of route of transmission, a third one, are traditions that come into both Ugaritic and Bible from elsewhere independently. For example, from the Transjordan. That is, we have on number 3 on your handout, you'll see references to Ashtaroth and Edrei, these 2 Transjordanian names, both associated with with the Rephaim, speaking loosely, in both KT 1.108 and also in the book of Deuteronomy. Next, I'm going to skip, we heard a wonderful paper about the bilinguals today, so I'm going to skip this. My main point there on the handout is to say that the depth of Amorite tradition for our West Semitic deities has definitely been highlighted by the bilingual inscriptions that Professor Krebenik published with Andrew George. And some of this also goes with the section of An Anum, which actually lists the family of Martu, which includes Ashratum. It's very nice. Okay, next listed on your handout are specific Ugaritic names known in the Hebrew Bible, which are suggestive of a shared literary cultural context. And these are all listed on your handout. These are, for example, Baal's enemies, such as Leviathan and Tunanu, as well as the seven-headed beast, the name of Mount Saphon, which I've already mentioned, his epithet, Cloud Rider, the Daniel mentioned in Ezekiel 14 and 20, and as I mentioned, the place names in Transjordan. Perhaps most importantly for this discussion is another name shared by Ugaritic and biblical sources, and that's the name of Israel itself. It's not always given the press that it deserves, I think. The Ale element in this name may suggest that whatever Israel was originally, Ale was apparently its god. I will not review profiles and titles of the Ugaritic god Ale, much less Ale, or the goddesses Asherah and Anat with their reflexes in the Hebrew Bible. I would instead direct your attention to the wonderful book listed on your handout on page 3, produced by Professor Lewis. In short, the information that I've noted thus far shows that the Levant from Ugarit to Israel enjoyed several pathways of intercultural engagement. Part 2. So the title had to do with literature, so I'm going to really now turn to the question of literature. Among the many contributions made to biblical studies over the past 2 decades is the work in Ugaritic pertaining to the understanding of poetic line and parallelism, as well as many other broader literary features. I'd like to focus my remarks on composition in Ugaritic and biblical literature in light of 2 major developments. And this is where I should say biblical studies has contributed to Ugaritic studies. So the first of the 2 developments I want to mention are what some scholars have called the scribal turn in biblical studies, represented by books by Bill Schneidewin, Carl Vandertoord, David Carr, and several others. The same topic of scribalism has become important in Ugaritic studies, thanks especially to the fine work of Dennis Pardee, Robert Howley, Ignacio Marquez Roa, and others. As a result, it is now evident that whether a text had a prior history or not before the scribes get a hold of it, it passed through scribal composition by definition. By implication, the scribal context of any text production may be regarded as one of its settings in life. So it had at least one setting in life, maybe 2 or more. But we don't usually talk about that when we talk about Sitzenleben. The second development is the role of memory in composition. Scholars have long focused, rightly in my opinion, on the oral performance informing Ugaritic literary compositions. More recently, important work on this topic has been undertaken by Professor Shirley Nathaniel-Zari, and we will hear tomorrow from Hannah Bash on this topic as well. An important element in the discussion of scribalism and orality has been memory. Orality utilized memory. Ugaritic texts reflect what we might call their scribal memory orality interface. That's a mouthful. You probably shouldn't say it, you should just read it. It's easier to read. I will focus first on the data that the literary texts themselves give about this interface that informs their composition, and then I will offer a little reconstruction about their performance based largely on text 23. It's often called the birth of the beautiful gods, which I will do very quickly in summary form. So first, composition. So what does composition look like in Ugaritic literature? The beginning point for understanding the composition of Ugaritic literature is the paratextual information that its own literature provides. As Dennis Pardee, Nicholas Wyatt, and others have noted, the Bale cycle contains important paratextual information. In other words, elements that surround and interact with the main literary text, but is not considered part of the text itself. I wish to focus on one set of paratextual scribal composition, which is set off from the narrative poems in the Bale cycle. I'll also mention the example in Akkad. In the case of the Bale cycle, specifically 1.4, column 5, lines 41 to 42, a brief prose section is demarcated by scribal lines within the poetic narrative. Here, the Bale cycle, in its written form, refers to its own oral recitation. So you get this on, what is that, pages 4 and 5 of your handout? 3 to 4? Yeah. So you'll see that the line that the poetic line that precedes the scribal lines is the poetic narration that he, that is Bale, sent for Kothar Wachasis. The line that follows this prose insertion resumes the poetic narrative with the same God mentioned, Kothar Wachasis arrived. Within the scribal lines, the reciter of the narrative poem is being instructed to include from memory, unwritten material from the time Kothar is sent for by messengers to the time that Kothar arrives back on the scene. The unwritten material would be somewhat extensive, yet fairly stereotypical, because the same material is used for Kothar in a different part of the Bale cycle, back in Tablet 1. So what was included? There's a narration probably known of messengers traveling to Kothar. They're addressed to Kothar using traditional speech formula, including the instruction of the god to travel to Baal, and then finally an account of Kothar traveling to Baal. And all of this is already in Tablet 1, line for line. This insertion shows that the Bale cycle was not written simply as a complete poetic narrative. You might say there are 3 Bale cycles. There's just the written text, there's the written text with the paratextual information, and then there's the actual recited text that includes all the oral memorized material that is not written out. So there are 3 Bale cycles. Okay. We may note also that the final column of Akkad has a similar prose scribal instruction. It's written on the left-hand edge of column 4 of the 3rd tablet, and it simply says, here one turns or returns to the recitation. It's very similar to the instructions in the Bale cycle. To judge from these prose instructions inserted into the poetic narratives of the Bale cycle and Akkad, the reciter of this text is supposed to know what the content of the instruction is referring to, and thereby to add from memory orally to the performance. The inserted instruction not only indicates information not in the narrative itself, but it also points to the Bale cycle's own oral performance. This insertion gives rise to the larger question about the purpose of the Bale cycle's written form. It has been suggested by Pardee and others that it served as a memorization aid for learning to orally perform the narrative, masparu, as it's mentioned in the text, which is embedded therein. In this case, then, the Bale cycle shows the interface, back to my lingo, the interface of the written product with its apparent use in oral recitation, using memory to include the information that has to be added orally. Now, in turn, scholars have often emphasized, well, we only have one copy of the Bale cycle. Okay, more on that later. But it does point out then the implied point that the oral recitation of the Bale cycle may have been its chief means of promulgation, by definition. The scribal instructions in Bale and Akkad suggest some core of memorized materials. For such memorized materials, we may also note what scholars have identified as a number of shorter extracts from the Bale cycle. While these shorter texts strongly resemble passages in the Baal cycle, hence they were thought to be extracts, they've also been recognized as showing some variation with their parallels in the Baal cycle. The variation conforms between what David Carr, biblicist in New York, has called memory variance. He works on biblical texts. According to Carr, the classic signs of such variance include the inclusion or exclusion of minor particles, exchange of semantically similar words and phrases, and larger scale shifts in order, as well as changes of wording, order, or insignificant shifts in grammar and syntax. Memory variants, in Carr's terms, reflect what he calls changes typical of transmission through memory. By memory variance, Carr is referring to two or more instances of the same text showing basically the same lines with minor variations. He is not referring to variant versions of a text or tradition, which may include additional sections, characters, different means used to undertake action, or different spatial or temporal settings. So we need to define what we really mean by this. They're not just, so what it really means is we're refining what it means even to talk about a parallel. We've talked about parallels for 70 years of Ugaritic studies. It's time to refine this. While Carr's discussion focuses on Hebrew texts, his criteria for memory variance applies well to short Ugaritic texts characterized as extracts from the Baal cycle. The case I've given you on your handout, which I just asked you to look at it on pages 4 and 5, is KTU 1.5, column 1, lines 14 to 22, a very famous passage, and its so-called extract in 1.133, lines 1 to 10, which, by the way, is found in the house of the Hurrian priest, not in the house of the high priest. So they're in two different locations on the tell. And you can see, if you just look at the lines quickly, you're going to see variation of vocabulary, transposition of a line, a further colon, and the addition, or perhaps, but I think less likely, subtraction of particles. I have other examples, but I'm just only going to give you one example per each phenomenon. The Baal cycle itself contains what might be considered memory variance. For example, morphological variation appears in the parallel speeches of Anat and Athirat in tablets 3 and 4 that they make before Ale. Anat refers to your wisdom, whereas Athirat uses the verb you are wise. It's this kind of minor variation that fits the paradigm of memory variance. And I have a lot of other examples. The one I do want to share with you, because it raises an important question about the relationship, a very difficult question about the relationship between the first two tablets of the Baal cycle. The two tablets, K2 1.1 column 3 and 1.2 column 3, contain commands to Kothar to build Yam's palace. This has always been a difficult question, and no one has ever really figured this out. They're very close. There's some minor differences, and they could be, if you found one as an extract on a different context, you might think it's just one of these other extracts, but it raises a question about these two tablets, about whether they provide or they're inclusive of what might have been variant beginnings of the Baal cycle. The principle at work then would not be consistency, but comprehensiveness. And this is an issue that also seems at work in some narrative duplication in the Pentateuch and elsewhere, narrative material in the Hebrew Bible. In any case, memory variants are quite widespread in Ugaritic narrative poetry, and as we shall see, biblical literature shares some memory variants with Ugaritic material. And I'm going to get to this in a minute, but I want to say it again. Biblical literature itself has some material that looks like memory variants of lines from Ugaritic. Okay. I want to briefly, before I get there, I just want to turn briefly to the implications of oral recitation of the Baal cycle for its performance. And there are signs in various places within the text and elsewhere in the Ugaritic corpus, beautifully studied by Professor Shirley Nathaniel-Zari. She considers song, musical instrumentation, body language, props and bodily action, possible some manner of staging by actors, and then the question of setting, whether it's palace or temple or both. I find both equally plausible. Commenting on KTU 1.23, which I think is an extremely important text in this regard, Pardee commented, the cult did not consist only of sacrifice, prayer, and song, but there was apparently such a thing as cultic theater. Through the extent and modalities of this acting out of mythological themes are presently unknown. Professor Lewis, who is in our midst, has characterized KTU 1.23 as a ritual or sacred play. I think that this is quite right. Now, I would point to you that you have the text of KTU 1.23 on your handout. I'm not going to read it. You're going to look at it while I yak away about it, okay? So you get the idea. It has two major sections. Lines 1 to 29 have 9 sections of instructions for various kinds of performance, and then lines 30 to 76 contain a narrative poem. And the theme of the goodly gods is the major subject of both. So I see some levels of intersection between the ritual sections and the narrative poem. What that intersection exactly looked like, I couldn't tell you. No one really knows. We speculate, but I'll skip that. One of the things I do find interesting, though, about this text for the Baal cycle is that it shares an intertextual relationship. The description of the god Mot, a lip to heaven, a lip to earth, a lip to heaven, tongue to the stars. Description of Mot in the Baal cycle compared to the goodly gods in text 23. On your handout, you'll see at lines 61 to 63, a lip to earth, a lip to heaven. Wonderful line. And even beyond this, I think text 23 furnishes an important analog with a scene from the Baal cycle, also well known to scholars of Ugaritic. We have the description of the destruction of Mot by vine pruners in lines 8 to 11 of text 23 at the bottom of page 5 of your handout, which has long been compared to Anat's destruction of Mot expressed in terms of serial imagery, largely. That's in text tablet 6 of the Baal cycle. And they have there's a lot of analogy between them. The manner of destruction and his decimation. The comparison may suggest maybe a way in which the scene in the Baal cycle could have been performed when it was recited. I don't know. I'm speculating. If the Baal cycle was sung accompanied by performance, perhaps the episode describing Anat and Mot then perhaps had human actors involved. Perhaps. In any case, text 23 is suggestive of some possible performance elements for the Baal cycle. What I would suggest is with their overlapping themes and oral variants, the two texts appear to share an overlapping oral performance world. Okay. Part 4, back to biblical composition. With scribalism, memory, and orality in mind, I now turn to my final subject, namely comparison of Ugaritic and biblical literature. We're aware that some genres have an oral grounding, such as blessings and curses. These are well known from the written texts. But we have some oral genres known that are not at Ugaritic in biblical literature, but they're known from elsewhere, and we would suspect they could be at Ugaritic also. So we have to be aware of oral genres that aren't attested. I'm thinking of prayers in childbirth. We don't have any of those from Ugaritic. We don't have lullabies as we do in Mesopotamian literature, or harvest songs. Great things. Now, using genres as a starting point, I want to begin with some considerations of biblical literature. For Ugaritic, the prominent genres are listed on pages 11 to 14 of your handout. What we will see are some notable absences. There are no Ugaritic prose narratives, and notably no primeval story of creation or flood, no legal corpora, no prophetic texts or even references to prophecy, no separate wisdom collections as such, although there's wisdom tropes in literary texts. There's no apocalyptic, that's no great surprise, and relatively few self-standing prayers which I was a little more surprised that we don't have more. The steles at Ugaritic are all votives. There are no public inscriptions of kings, much less royal narratives or chronicles. By contrast, prominent biblical genres include prose narrative, both on a massive scale, Genesis through Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and on a lesser scale, Jonah, Ruth, Esther, Ezra, etc. Oh, even Daniel 1 to 6. We have half of a new commentary on Daniel 1 to 6. It's just about done. I'm looking forward. Rarely in the Hebrew Bible do we find scribal texts or administrative or economic texts, but outside of the Bible, Hebrew inscriptions down through the 8th century do show typical prose genres of scribal exercises, for example, abecedaries, labels marking ownership, lists, and even letters. The Hebrew Bible contains only snippets of poetic narrative and rather little by way of incantations, although some psalms are thought to reflect awareness or reflexes of such. One of the greatest genre overlaps between Ugaritic and biblical literature falls in ritual instructional literature. Now, some of the genres in the Hebrew Bible, but not in Ugaritic, have been attributed to monarchic period Akkadian influence. These could include the flood stories, very prominent in Mesopotamia, but not in the West. Maybe prose creation story, maybe. The legal collection of the Covenant Code, which is often compared to the Code of Hammurabi, and royal chronicles. We don't see prophetic collections until outside of the Bible until the Neo-Assyrian period, which are really royal prophetic collections. The Bible's known prophetic collections are decidedly not royally sponsored by comparison. That is, royal oracles, we'll call them. Those are embedded in texts like Psalms and elsewhere, but the prophetic collections are in Isaiah, etc., are generally not royal. Rather, they show signs of what I would call Israel's post-monarchic Bible, which I will return to. Narrative is important in both Ugaritic and the Bible, but as we've noted, there are different media, poetry in Ugaritic, prose in the Hebrew Bible. And we might put this contrast in this way for the late Bronze Age down through at least the 9th or 8th century. Poetry was the traditional medium for oral literature. Prose, accompanied by scribal lines, was the traditional medium of ownership labels as well as scribal administration, not only in lists, but legal texts as well as letters. And these are often for administration across a distance. So where does prose narrative of the Hebrew Bible come from? There's been some interesting speculation. Prose narrative seems, it's hardly a late invention in and of itself if we remember the late Bronze Age story of Idrami written on his statue. This is already late Bronze. Even so, some scholars seem to think there's no prose narrative within Israel until much later. A current theory holds that prose narrative first appears in royal inscriptions in the second half of the 9th century, for example, in the Mesha stele, and people also talk about Tel Dan in this context. According to this view, narrative attested in West Semitic royal inscriptions itself developed under the influence of narrative in Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions that are moving into the West. Whether or not this explains the development of prose narrative in the Hebrew Bible, what we seem to see in 8th century in Israel was scribal prose along with ongoing parallel practice of oral poetry. And there was also mutual crossover influence, which I want to turn to now. The crossover from traditional poetic narrative to biblical prose narrative can be seen in a list of features, and these are on your handout. One is the topics of traditional poetic narrative in biblical narrative prose. And I have to give a shout out. The first time I ever came to Germany, I got to visit with Klaus Westermann. And he, of course, had written an important book on comparing the promises to the Father in Ugaritic and biblical narrative. People often forget that people like him worked on Ugaritic. There are a lot of the people in Germany, Rolf Rentwerf, Otto Kaiser wrote on the cosmic sea for his dissertation. They all were Bible and ancient Near Eastern people until they weren't. In any case, it's interesting about the history of scholarship. Royal challenges in Kirta and the David stories have been compared. It's a little looser. Number 2, there are tropes of poetic narrative informing prose narrative in the Bible. Frank Polak has written on this, and I've given you a couple examples of the phrases that he's decided are crossovers from poetic narrative to prose narrative. We also have prose adaptation of narrative poetic motifs. Ed Greenstein has nicely noted the compression in biblical prose of the traditional 7-day unit, like in the Battle of Jericho. It's great. Love that story. But I would have liked it even more if they recounted every day the same thing over and over again like they do in the Baal cycle. Finally, the currently debated matter of the Yoctul preterite in initial position of Kola in traditional narrative poetry perhaps was the model. Remember, Yoctul preterite often occurs in the first position in narrative Kola. And so does the Vav consecutive. So was it, I raise it as a question, was it a model for the development of the Vav consecutive in prose? I raise it as a question. Now, within the biblical corpus, we also see a corresponding crossover from prose to poetry. More specifically, long recognized prose particles come into Hebrew poetry, and often these, I listed these on pages 15 to 16. People commonly talk about asher, the definite article, the direct object particle et, and Vav consecutive. These are often considered secondary developments within West Semitic, with some incipient developments seen already in Ugaritic prose. These are listed at the top of your handout on page 15. Now, while this crossover was taking place, traditional poetic forms continued, though not in narrative poetry. As pointed out long ago, beginning at least with Umberto Cassuto, the many variants and broader parallels between Ugaritic and biblical literature suggest ongoing knowledge of tropes of narrative poetry. A maximal view of this idea was expressed by Ed Greenstein, quote, Israelite poets of all periods drew directly on the epics of Baal and Akkad. Okay, that's his quote. I probably could not affirm this strong claim in this form. He doesn't explain exactly what it means to draw directly. There are several Ugaritic and biblical lines that are famous parallels. These conform specifically to David Carr's criteria as memory variants, but they also show additional adaptation. So this is the thing that's a little bit different. Within the Ugaritic corpus, which is a more synchronic look, we have some diachronic development with these. And I'm drawing a little bit on the work of Deborah Scoggins Ballantyne, which she uses the phrase continued adaptation. These are listed on page 15 of your handout. I'm just going to focus on the most famous one. The third one listed, this is K2 1.1, lines 1 to 3, etc., and Isaiah 27:1. And you'll see in the bold is the material that's actually different. And in the italics is the stuff that's the same, more or less the same. So what we see is it's difficult to affirm the quote attributed to Wilfrid Lambert, claiming that Isaiah 27:1 is, quote, a direct quote taken from K2 1.5, column 1. Because if he quoted it, he messed it up. There's a lot of material in there that isn't the same. Marguerite calls it the nearest verbatim parallel that we have between Bible and Ugaritic. I'd suggest instead that this so-called parallel is in fact an adapted memory variant in Ugaritic and Hebrew Bible. And I'd further suggest, and you'll see these on pages 15 to 16 of your handout, is a literary construction of various kinds where deities, warrior deities, have certain opponents. And we see them in the mythological material, and we see them in incantational literature, and we also find them even in against human enemies. And I think that all of them are adaptations. My own favorite one is the divine conflict myth Baal versus Yam for the royal power against the king's enemies in Psalm 89, verse 26. I, that is the deity, will set his power, his hand, the king's hand on sea, on rivers, his right hand. And this, in turn, has been thought to be applied to cosmic enemies in apocalyptic literature in Daniel 7. Going back to John Emerton in an article in Journal of Theological Studies from, I think, 1959, followed by Frank Cross, Paul Mosca, and Deborah Ballantyne. The depths of such memory variants and their ongoing usage and reusage points to the ongoing role of memory and perhaps performance in the construction of the Hebrew Bible's major works and collections. What really distinguishes Ugaritic and biblical literature, apart from differences in genre, is the Bible's massive and mixed collections. Late monarchic writing and post-exilic literary projects included major scribal redactional productions and interventions of various kinds. I've listed some of these on page 16. All of this scribal activity highlights a final contrast between Ugaritic and biblical literature, namely the time frames in their production. Written Ugaritic literature seems to have been generated perhaps within 1 century, perhaps 2, out of oral traditions that in some cases go back a millennium. The opposite is the case with biblical literature written over several centuries with only some signs of older oral performance, which in some cases may be correlated with Ugaritic poetic tradition. With the Bible, we are far from the older oral backgrounds and often well beyond the monarchy. What stands out for me is the Bible's massive collections in Israel's post-monarchic Bible. While many questions remain, today we can appreciate how much the field has learned in just under a century, thanks to the discovery of the Ugaritic texts. Thank you.